Hi, my name is Paul Edward Costa. I'm a writer, a teacher, a spoken word performer, and an events host here in the Greater Toronto Area. So I started out basically getting into writing when I was around in high school. It started out when I was performing with a band, and I was singing in the band. We were doing a punk band at the time, and I started out writing the lyrics for it. And the lyric writing slowly kind of evolved into poetry, and poetry was largely what I did between the ages of when I was in high school and around university. And around towards the end of university, a friend kind of challenged me and said, I want you to try, maybe you should try writing something that's outside what you normally do. So I decided to try my hand at writing a short story. Now, first couple were not very good, as none of my early poetry was either. But I liked it, and I liked the possibilities of it, and what I wanted to do was kind of get more into storytelling, and my attention gradually focused more from kind of the abstract in the poetry world, and exploring things in kind of a non-linear way. The spoken word that I do came kind of out of that as a way of promoting that, and as a way of, you know, testing work, gauging audience reaction. And because I was a singer in a band, I don't think I ever really wanted to get away entirely from the performance aspect. I am not a full-time author-writer, and that is largely why I insist on saying writer, teacher, spoken word performer. My day job is as a high school teacher. I work in the Peel District School Board, teaching largely English, although I can and have done history as well. How do I balance those two things? It's largely dedication. I mean, there's a certain level of motivation that I can't necessarily explain. But, you know, I focus on doing a lot more writing in the summer times. I'd still kind of maintain the energy for that in the evenings and the weekends when I can. I also work in smaller bits. I tend not to do massive sort of huge marathons of writing where I'm writing, you know, 10,000 words in a day or 5,000 words. I tend to do it in smaller chunks that come together. That could also explain my preference for short stories and flash fiction and poetry. It can be a challenge at sometimes, of course, but I try and find the ways that they kind of can help each other, my particular job and my particular art form. I find largely that it depends on the medium in which I'm working. If I'm working in poetry, it tends to be more of a direct treatment of an issue or a thing or an incident. So if I have, let's say, a political or social issue that I want to make a point about, I'll sometimes go more towards the poetry because it allows me to kind of treat more directly, and also I'm not tied down so much by the realism of things and believability. You can kind of play a little bit more fast and loose with mythical images and surrealism and a certain level of dense, concentrated emotion and dense, concentrated writing that you can't do otherwise. So teaching keeps you in contact with a lot of personalities that aren't like your own, and it keeps kind of your finger on the world and your finger on the pulse of the world, so that you can kind of maintain an awareness of what's going on in the culture, of historical realities that students from other countries may expose me to that I may not have found out about on my own. I think the biggest way that growing up in Mississauga has influenced my work was mainly through the other artists in the local area that I've met and the influence that I've had through that. I've been amazed at the range, diversity, and the amount of local talent I've found around here. And, you know, there's often this cliche around, you know, that you find in bigger cities sometimes that we are a big city, but in more cosmopolitan, I guess, or established cosmopolitan areas, that sort of, oh, out there's nothing, you know, out there's nothing going on, which is, you know, blatantly untrue. You know, when I come from Mississauga into events, sometimes in Toronto, and I say people, you know, I came here from Mississauga, they act like, you know, I've spent the last 2 weeks marching from the middle of Saskatchewan. But that's the thing, because there's a tendency to always look to the other, to the outside. And I'm not saying that's bad, but what I mean is you don't want to ignore what's right around you as well. So some people have this view that they have to go to somewhere else to find the culture, which perhaps was the case, but with globalization and technology and social media and all those things, there's a lot happening locally, and I'm amazed by the people who kind of make that decision that, I want to make the city in which I live a better place. My biggest accomplishment as an author or a writer, it's hard to define because there's personal goals and there's professional goals. So, that said, it's the publications that I think are the things I'm most proud of. So the first time I got, a poem published independently, that was a really big deal for me. I think it was in Diaspora Dialogue's website, and that was independently. And the first piece of prose I had published was a piece called The Chronicle of Everything, and it was published in a journal called Timber Journal, which is put out by the University of Colorado, I believe, at Boulder. And those are a big deal for me. The first time I put out a book, and that was a big deal because it's the first time I had sort of a book with my name on it that I could sell and hand out. And that one, I sell it largely more myself at the events I go to, but it was my first test run at that, and now I'm working on getting something that's a more substantial full book. That was a novella. So 3 things I would say to aspiring writers that I would want them to know would largely be that I think 1, I would encourage young writers to not immediately run into self-publishing. I do think you can do great things with self-publishing. I think a lot of people have done wonderful work with self-publishing, but I would encourage people to get some experience with traditional publishing as well. The reason I think that's important is it gets you just used to rejection. As a teacher, one of the biggest problems we have in schools, I think now, is that students just don't know how to fail or how to take failure. Secondly, please, and this is more for writers who are going to be doing spoken word, I would say treat it like as a musician or as an athlete would. You have to rehearse, you have to practice the stuff before you do it. You shouldn't be deciding on your set list when you're on stage. You should have that prepped up beforehand. You should be able to modify it in response to the audience, which might be some calculations you got to run in your head when you get there. I would say that the third piece of advice would largely be to try and develop a critical mind outside of yourself. Now there's various ways of doing this. Some people write it, leave it for a week, come back to it later with a different set of eyes. Some people can kind of like read it and try and assume a different perspective. Some people have a close friend who helps them. There's many ways of doing it, but you gotta kind of remove your ego from the equation. So a few things coming up. I've spent the last few years largely publishing in literary journals and magazines, so now what I'm doing is I'm starting to take those pieces and put them together into book-length collections that I can send out to publishers. And I'm working on now getting a poetry book ready to send out and getting a collection of the sci-fi speculative stories of mine to send out. Some people have been wanting me to write more nonfiction, and I've been kind of resistant to that for a long time, but I've been thinking more recently that I might set something to nonfiction, whether it starts being more reviews. I have done 2 interviews with local artists and community members, so I might go back to doing interviews, series, or nonfiction writing to submit to places and publish, particularly related to local art. My name is Paul Edward Costa, a writer, teacher, spoken word performer. Thank you so much for listening to all I've had to say here. If you want to find out more about what I do and read some of my writing, you can follow me on social media, Paul Costa, or Paul Edward Costa, sorry. Look that up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm also on Amazon. You can find some of my work through there. You'll be able to find all that stuff and find out more of my work and what I'm up to.